Of Emerson's land.
Yeah, there's no other place it could be.
How could you lose it?
Yeah, well, there's a reason they lost it. So this is a long and convoluted story, which I'm sure different people have different versions of. So this is the bean field. Guys, it was 2.5 acres. It ran from that gate to where the trail curves out of sight down there, and 100 yards in that direction. 2.5 acres, like about the size of a couple of football fields. These were not like green beans. These were navy beans that Thoreau was growing. He had, what do you say, 7 miles of rows. So the rows were 30 inches apart, running this way. He's hoed them every morning that summer from like sun up to noon. It's a shite of work, as my cousin in Ireland would say. And he said he never had them all hoed once, which I think means that, you know, he had to keep going around. All right. So so there's a couple parts of the story. One morning, since you asked, I got a phone call. I was sitting at my desk, and it was Brad Dean, who's since died. He had a heart condition, but he was working up there at the Walden Woods Project, putting together Thoreau's manuscripts and stuff like that. And Brad said, "Where do you think the bean field was?" And I said, "God, I don't know, up by the road somewhere." And he said, "You're the first person who ever said that," when I called him up.
Which is crazy.
And I said, well, it kind of had to be there. Like, he heard farmers. I said, I never really went and looked for it. He said, no one seems to know where it is. Emerson's son left a map that shows it right here. He heard farmers who are like commenting on his beans. So for some reason, the bean field kind of got lost for a while there.
Also, Emerson's property, that first piece that he bought, is this weird, right? Like triangular shape. This is the only place.
Well, Emerson quickly bought another adjacent piece next to it that put it out into a rectangle by the time Thoreau was living.
Okay, same time. Okay.
So anyway, Thoreau planted 2.5 acres of beans here, and the interesting question is why? Why?
Protein, barter.
Why? Why would you do a thing like that? He had to pay some guy. He said that the sprout wood on it had been cut, and that he had to pay a guy to plow out the stumps, which is interesting because he said it was like 15 years earlier, and I don't see how you could easily plow them out. So I'm a little curious on that score. But anyway, he lists all his expenses, and then he lists these beans. Why did he grow these beans? What's that?
Cheapest.
Cheapest? What do you do with the beans? Let's start with that, you Thoreau scholars. What's that? He sold them.
Yeah.
He sold almost all of them. He makes this whole thing about how he didn't like beans. So he sells them. You know, he's growing them on one of the worst soils for farming in Concord. So dry. Beans would grow here, almost nothing else would. He knew that. He was a really good gardener. Right? He kept Emerson's garden. He grew a garden for Hawthorne. He had a garden at home at his folks' house all his life. He wasn't incompetent. What in the world was the guy up to? He was working so hard. He had all these expenses. He sold the beans, and his net was what? $8.71.5, which he could have earned in a few days. What is the moral of this story?
He was determined to know beans.
He says he was determined to know beans. He says he kind of enjoyed it. He says he enjoyed it so much it almost became a dissipation. What do you think?
Did he employ some people?
He didn't employ anybody. He was trying to kind of earn a living by farming is kind of what he's getting at. But why sell them? He actually, the next year, he says he grew a much smaller garden, and that worked out, you know, some potatoes and so forth, somewhere up here, and that worked out a little better.
Going to eavesdrop on the road?
Yeah, well, okay. It's a conundrum. What is the point of this exercise? Actually, it's a double conundrum because there's the guy who did it, who was whatever he was, 28 years old or something, but then there's a guy who wrote about it, who was creating this narrator with something to say. It's not too wet. Let me read to you the last paragraph of that. Thank you for the book's sake. So this is what Henry Thoreau says about the bean field in the last paragraph of that chapter. We are wont to forget the sun looks on our cultivated fields and on the prairies and forests without distinction. They all reflect and absorb his rays alike, and the former make but a small part of the glorious picture which he beholds in his daily course. In his view, the earth is all equally cultivated like a garden. And he goes on, these beans have results which are not harvested by me. Do they not grow for the woodchucks partly? The woodchuck ate a quarter acre. Right, and then he ate the woodchuck, which isn't in here, right. He says, right. Is it, how then shall our harvest fail? Shall I not rejoice also at the abundance of the weeds, whose seeds are the granary of the birds? It matters little comparatively whether the fields fill the farmers' barns. What do you think of that?
I think it's just using nature in all different ways and recognizing that the land is the source of cultivation, not just for humans, but
Right.
the animals, and I mean it's just part of the circle of life.
Yeah,
We
and
don't own it. What right do we
we have to eat.
Well, no, we don't own it. So when we think that the beans are for us and us alone, we assume some sort of a superiority.
We
he
do.
really shifts the point of view of thinking there when he says, but it's not just me that the beans fed or my
Right.
fellow man.
Right, there's a woodchuck,
It's
there's some birds,
right,
there's the
and that
weeds.
the sun's
Right.
not just for me, the beans
Right,
are just for
right.
me. I mean, there's a very big shift.
So it's an
there.
invocation of the importance of wildness within nature and these other creatures. Can I say one of the commentary on this was written by Michael Pollan in his book Second Nature, long before he became real famous for The Omnivore's Dilemma. He was pretty well known as the author of a book called Second Nature, which is all about gardening and how important it is. Pollan quotes that passage I just read, shall we not rejoice? And Pollan writes, rejoice, Henry, and starve. His point being that, you know, we're worshiping as environmentalists wild nature too much and good gardening not enough. You think?
I kind of think that he has at some point made the comment that, you know, the people who commit themselves to farming year after year and developing and growing the farm really don't get the big yield. And he didn't get, I mean, he got the $8, but he doesn't really get a magnificent yield. So,
In terms of monetary return for
Yeah.
all the work. I think that's absolutely key, and we will revert to the next to last paragraph in the chapter to see what he says about that. But on this point, I would just, on the wildness point, I would go with what you were saying, that he basically sacrificed a tenth of his crop to the wildness, to the woodchuck, and all the rest of that. He also knew that the latest tax valuation in Concord showed that 10% of Concord was still in woods. That's all that was left. So I think he's basically not calling to let everything go back to wild and let us starve, but that we do need to somehow incorporate wildness into our cultivated landscapes as a whole.
There's a great conservation area.
Is
But-
there
Where I
also
live that
a
grows
question
crops just
about
for
conquering?
wildlife.
So,
Just
he's
corn
such a
and
massive
beans.
contradiction because he's also at one point talking about the savage nature within himself, which
Yeah.
at one point
Yeah,
he
yeah.
celebrates, and at another point says, "But I have to conquer some of those base desires."
Right.
And so, at what point, you know, is all of that work conquering other desires too? I'm not saying that he addresses that there.
I think he addresses that.
There's a lot of discipline there that is going into, you know, not doing other things.
I think he addresses that in terms of eating the woodchuck, which he does
Yes.
express
Right.
some mixed feelings about.
Right,
But he sort of feels like, you know, he ate my beans and it sort of made sense. But on the other hand, he wasn't so sure about that. Yeah, but no, I think it's that we mistake it if we just see it as a polarized choice between cultivation and wildness, and that Thoreau wasn't saying everything should be wild. He was saying, look, our town is now 90% cultivated. Can we not hang on to that last tenth? And using this bean field there as a metaphor for that. And that Pollan has really created a straw man there. But let's go to what I think the real moral of this thing comes out in the next to last paragraph. And one of my favorites in, tilt it that way a little, thanks. In all of Thoreau's writing, if I can find it. Ancient poetry and mythology suggest at least that husbandry was once a sacred art, but it is pursued with irreverent haste and heedlessness by us, our object being to have large farms and large crops merely, he says. We don't sacrifice to the terrestrial Jove, we sacrifice to Plutus rather, by avarice and selfishness, and a groveling habit from which none of us is free, of regarding the soil as property, or the means of acquiring property chiefly. The landscape is deformed, husbandry is degraded with us, and the farmer leads the meanest of lives. He knows nature but as a robber. So I think what he's done here, and Bob Gross has written about this too actually a little bit, is create a parable for farming in Concord where these guys are working their brains out, and a lot of them are losing money. They're not just not having a tiny profit, they're in debt, right? He says, you know, farming in Concord, he says, we speculate in herds of cattle to buy our shoestrings. And so I think the point is that commercialization of agriculture we were talking about before, that when you go to try to market your crops, you find out that all your work was for next to nothing. And that we should, as much of his writing is about, rebalance the amount of work we do to earn our living and the amount of other kinds of things we spend our time at.
Like there's something with like, did the beans take manure? Did it take like kind of those other?
To use manure.
Because like there's also like a meditative thing of like he's here for 6 hours
Yeah, he liked
hoeing, and then you have